Okay, welcome to the first of the statewide synchronous lecture sessions for Sociology 111. Today we're going to be covering Chapter 6 of the Sociology textbook by Richard Schaefer. That is what is being covered in this particular class session. So, right now I am the only one here, but I'm recording this, so if anybody would like to listen in later, I will make this available. Chapter 6 covers groups and organizations. So what are we going to be looking at? We're going to be trying to understand groups, understand organizations, take a look at the changing workplace, the way that technology is affecting the workplace, examine social policy and organization, the state of the unions throughout the world, and then we'll be discussing, do we behave differently in large groups than we do in small ones? And if so, how? How do we make large organizations manageable? What effect are current social changes having on the structure of groups? All these are going to be topics we discuss. First thing, of course, we need to do is we need to actually define what a group is. Sociologically, a group begins when you have more than one person. It's two or more people with similar norms, values, and expectations who interact regularly. Now, what this means is that standing in line at the grocery store with somebody does not constitute a group. A group has regular interactions, and they share something in common. Hobby groups, social activism groups, they have some kind of interest, some kind of value, some kind of behavior that draws them together. Even people competing in amateur sport leagues, that tends to be defined as a group. It's that shared expectations, shared norms, shared values in the context of the group and the group interaction, regular group interaction, that kind of defines a group. So, but when we talk about the size of the group, two or more people makes up a group. Now, Charles Horton Cooley, who you may remember from The Looking Glass Self, also came up with this idea of primary groups, and then this was expanded into the concept of secondary groups as well. Primary group, small group with intimate face-to-face association and cooperation. Secondary group, formal and personal group with little social intimacy or mutual understanding. Another way of thinking of this is that a primary group has as its purpose the group itself. A secondary group is a group brought together by some other purpose. Family, primary group. Work, secondary group. That makes sense. In general, primary groups will tend to be smaller groups and secondary groups will tend to be larger groups. In general. That's not always the case, though. If you think about people working at a Family Express, there may be 2 or 3 people working there at any one time. They have regular interactions. They have similar norms and values at work. So they are defined as a group, but it's not a primary group simply because there's only 2 or 3 of them. It's still a secondary group because they don't really share the social intimacy outside of the work setting. They may, but it's not in the context of work. It's a group driven by a purpose rather than the group itself being the purpose. We can also think of groups in terms of in-group and out-group. In-group, any group or category to which people feel they belong. Out-group, any groups or categories to which people feel they do not belong. Essentially, in-group is what we would define as us. Out-group is what we would define as them. We can see this developing. Conflict between in-groups and out-groups can turn violent on a personal as well as a political level. Think about race, ethnicity as the basis of kind of a group categorization. Religion. Even just politics itself. Some of the meetings where you have very conservative members of the Republican Party and very liberal members of the Democrat Party, those can turn not just into shouting matches, but into violent confrontations as well. But yeah, when we think about in-group and out-group, essentially in-group is where we feel we belong, out-group is where we feel we don't belong. Another type of group is a reference group, and it's any group that individuals use as a standard for evaluating their own behavior. Examples of a reference group might include family. What will my parents think if they see me acting this way? We're using them as a reference group to shape or evaluate our own behavior. Peer group becomes a reference group. In fact, during adolescence, peer group becomes a more important reference group than family as a reference group. Work can be a reference group. We look at ourselves in the context of work and think about how we're performing our job. So reference groups set and enforce standards of conduct and belief. Religion can become a reference group. Your particular congregation that you belong to. Thinking about how congregants might view actions of yours. As I've pointed out here, there are a number of reference groups that people can use. And these can be used and influence us kind of at the same time. Even when we're at work and we're thinking about work, we might also be thinking about our religious affiliation. In the context of how we deal with people at work. So, okay. Within a group, what you may see develop from time to time are what are called coalitions. Temporary or permanent alliances geared towards a common goal. This can happen in all different types of contexts. Think about reality TV on Big Brother. Everybody is there. They're all kind of a group together because they're all there with the goal of competing for the $500,000 prize. But within that, people form alliances, and they may stay with the alliance all the way through the competition, or they may not. But essentially, when they form those alliances, it's with the common goal of eliminating other house guests. So here's a table just kind of showing you differences and a comparison of primary and secondary groups. Primary groups, generally they're small. Secondary groups usually are large. Primary group tends to be a relatively long period of interaction. Secondary group, outside of work, tends to be relatively short duration and organized more kind of like as a temporary thing. But even with work, how many times do we change jobs? Primary group tends to be an intimate group with face-to-face association, some emotional depth to the relationships, cooperative and friendly. Secondary groups, little social intimacy or mutual understanding. Relationships tend to be superficial, and it tends to be more formal and impersonal, oftentimes governed by an actual set of rules that are written down. So, when we talk about small versus large group, this is kind of based upon the work of Georg Simmel. Simmel was a German sociologist who did a lot of work on what we would call formal sociology, a sociology of numbers, looking specifically at how the number of people within a group affect the interactions and shape the interactions within that group. Famously, he wrote an essay called Dyads, Triads, and Larger Groups, in which he looked at the differences in interaction between a dyad and a triad. A dyad is a group of two, a triad is a group of three. Zimmel also made the distinction between what you would call a formal group as a large group and a party, which is an informal group but that has large numbers of members in there. When we talk about a small group, it's a group small enough for members to interact simultaneously. Everybody can be sharing the same conversation. This is possible up to maybe 6 people. After that, you start beginning to see the group kind of break down. Well, not break down, but break into coalitions. You'll see coalitions form within a group when it gets larger than about 6 members, really. And the reason you can think about that is, or a way to think about that is in the context of like a party, right? If there's 2 or 3 people at a party early before the party really gets going, how many conversations are there? Usually just one. By the time you get to 10 people, do you just have one conversation? Would one conversation even be possible to maintain? And that's why when we talk about a small group, we're talking about everybody can interact simultaneously. Just mentioned this, of course. Dyad is a 2-member group. A triad is a 3-member group. A dyad tends to be the most intimate of groups. Paradoxically, a dyad is also the most fragile of groups. A dyad cannot survive the loss of a member and remain a group. A triad can survive the loss of one member and still remain a group. Smaller groups have greater interaction. Paradoxically, they also have, they tend to be more fragile. They're more intimate, but they tend to be more fragile as well. So back to our discussion now. As I said, paradoxically, dyad is the most intimate group, yet at the same time, it's the most fragile group. A whole host of interactions, dynamics, change when you move from a dyad to a triad. Survivability. The group becomes greater than a collection of individuals. The group can survive the loss of a single member when you get to a triad. This is not possible with a dyad. In a dyad, you either have consensus or disagreement. Add one more person, you have the possibility of majority rule. In addition, you have the possibility of neutral mediation between 2 conflicting members. You have the possibility of divide and conquer, and you have the possibility of the one who profits from a conflict within the group. And the difference between the one who profits and divide and conquer is essentially divide and conquer. One person sets out to fracture the relationship between the other 2 group members. In the one who profits, they just profit from a conflict between 2 other group members. All of these dynamics become possible with the addition of a single member. So, when we talk about the fragility of a dyad, what we're essentially saying is not necessarily that just because there's only 2 people in a group, that group is automatically going to break up. It's just that it cannot survive the loss of a single member. And when we talk about changing dynamics, we talk about the addition of one more member. This is the formal sociology of Zimmel, how just the addition of one member changes what is possible in that group context. Okay, groupthink is collective pressure to conform to a predominant line of thought. There was an experiment done on pressure to conform, on group conformity, on the power of the group over the individual. People were offered, or people who were participating in the experiment thought they were participating in a visual acuity experiment. And they were shown a length of line, and then they were shown 3 varying lengths of line as a possibility of which one matched. They were the 6th person in line to select which one matched. Now, what they didn't know was that the 5 persons before them were actually part of the experiment and were told to select the wrong length of line. About a third of the time, people would select what the rest of the group had selected in direct contradiction of the evidence of their own senses. This is the pressure to conform to the predominant line of thought. This is the idea that we would rather belong to a group and go along with what the group is saying than be right and be on our own. It's kind of an interesting dynamic when you think about it. William H. White was the sociologist who kind of came up with the idea of groupthink. So, just to put a name with the person that's giving you these ideas. Some of the people that might be prone to this: high-level government leaders and advisors. Not limited to there, you may find groupthink going on in corporate boards and things like that. If everybody is conforming to a particular line of thought, it is hard to be the sole voice of dissent. That's the idea behind groupthink. Whoops. That's why oftentimes they'll have outside advisors or outside facilitators, because they can help to avoid groupthink in these situations. Sorry, I didn't mean to skip over that there. Okay. Now, this is actually on page 122 of your textbook, but what they're looking at here is jury decision-making processes affected by groupthink, and this is a specific case. This has been made into a movie. I think it was with Jodie Foster, but a heavily intoxicated woman, after having what was believed to be consensual sex by a man who had a few beers, essentially claims that she was raped. Some things to think about here. If you were the only person who decided that she was raped, how long would you be able to hold out? An excellent movie to watch on this is a movie starring Henry Fonda. It's called The 12th Man. 12 Angry Men. I'm sorry, not The 12th Man. 12 Angry Men. And in this, you see the pressure that can be exerted on somebody. Of course, this is a story about one man standing up and making a difference, and so Henry Fonda is able to resist groupthink. But you really see the pressure there sometimes of groupthink. I have served on a jury myself. Unfortunately, it was declared a mistrial. But oftentimes, the process happens that jurors are specifically instructed not to formulate an opinion, not to make a decision until they have heard both the prosecution side of the case and the defense's side of the case. Oftentimes, it happens that juries will begin making up their mind, jurors will begin making up their minds during the trial, despite the judge's instructions. Now, when we ask the question, is a jury a typical small group? The answer is no, because typical small groups tend to be long-term and tend to be primary groups. This is a secondary group. A jury is a secondary group. It is a group brought together by a purpose. So when we talk about small group, no, it would not be a typical small group. Okay. A special type of group is what's referred to as a formal organization. Okay? It's a group designed for special purpose and structured for maximum efficiency. What you find informal organizations often is a hierarchy, a bureaucracy. These are large secondary groups that have been very specifically structured. In the U.S., we have a number of different formal organizations. Any business for profit is really kind of a formal organization, but also 501(c)(3)s or 501(c)(3)s, which are charity groups, are formal organizations as well. Some of the examples given to you in the textbook include the U.S. Postal Service, McDonald's, and the Boston Pop. But they fulfill an enormous variety of personal and societal needs. Ascribed statuses can influence how we see ourselves within formal organizations. Gender, race, ethnicity, these type of things affect people standing within formal organizations. One example of this would be if we look at what has been kind of brought to the surface again by the events in Ferguson, Missouri, with the racial divide there. Oftentimes when African Americans find themselves in interactions within the criminal justice system, they see themselves as being treated differently than the majority white group. Now, I'm not saying that's not the case of what happens, but just being African American can influence you to believe that you're going to suffer differential justice. Differential justice does happen. There is a lot of evidence demonstrating that racial profiling goes on, that the way that white and black potential suspects are treated is quite different. But beyond that, gender, ethnicity, these things can all play into the way that people see themselves in formal organizations and shape the interactions within there. Max Weber was a sociologist who did a wide-ranging study. He was the one that gave us the idea of microsociology, the concept of Verstehen, which means understanding or comprehension. And he also gave us the idea of bureaucracy as a component of formal organization that uses rules and hierarchical ranking to achieve efficiency. He created what he called his ideal type. Now, ideal types are abstract examples of particular social situations and social institutions we can use to evaluate real-world examples. So he came up with the ideal type of bureaucracy in order to evaluate what he found in real-world bureaucracies. Max Weber, in his ideal type of bureaucracy, came up with some characteristics of a bureaucracy. Regardless of what that particular organization was brought together to do, there are characteristics of the bureaucratic structure within there. So, Weber created this construct for evaluating specific cases of this ideal type of bureaucracy. And so what he looked at was basic similarity of structure and process found in dissimilar enterprises. Whether it's a charity, whether it's a total institutional setting, such as a prison, a mental institution, or whether it's a utilitarian formal organization, which is like a for-profit business. So what are the characteristics? First, division of labor. People do specialized jobs. Specialized experts perform specific tasks. Think about Ivy Tech. Do we all do every job at Ivy Tech? No. There are instructors, there's administration, and people within instruction and administration have different areas of expertise. I teach sociology. That's the only subject I'm really credentialed to teach here at Ivy Tech because my degrees are in sociology. I'm not going to teach biology or math or anything else like that. So you find an extensive division of labor in the ideal type of bureaucracy. You find a hierarchy of authority, a chain of command. I am the program chair of the social sciences here at the Valparaiso campus of Ivy Tech Community College. The full-time faculty and adjuncts that teach in the social sciences here answer to me as their supervisor. I answer to the department chair for our region, who answers to the dean, who answers to the vice chancellor of academic affairs, so on and so on. There is a hierarchy of authority within bureaucratic structures. That's the chain of command. Written rules and regulations. APPM, which is the Academic Policies and Procedures Manual, Faculty Handbook, Student Handbook. All these things govern how things operate here at Ivy Tech. For those of you who have not read it, regardless of whether or not you've read it, you are responsible for the Student Code of Conduct found in the Student Handbook, which are the written rules and regulations governing student behavior. Faculty and administration have similar codes of conduct governing their behavior as well. So we have written rules and regulations. Impersonality. Everybody kind of gets treated the same. If I go to human resources, or if I get in touch with anybody and ask about a particular thing, first thing they ask me for when I am dealing with administration is probably the same thing they ask you for, which is your C number, right? When you go into student affairs, C number is what they want. If you just tell them, well, I'm John Smith. Well, what if there are 3 John Smiths? Your C number is your unique marker, but it gives you that feeling of impersonality. Everybody is kind of treated equally, and as Weber would write, without hatred or passion. But that's what also can lead to alienation in a society, according to Weber, is the impersonality of interaction within the bureaucratic structure. Employment based upon technical qualifications. In order to get this job, it's not enough that I know sociology. I have to have a degree. A master's degree or a doctorate degree, and 18 graduate credit hours of sociology from a college, a recognized college or university, in order for me to be able to teach here. So I have employment based upon technical qualifications. Performance is measured against specific standards. We have evaluation forms for evaluating faculty here. Now, one of the things that happens when we look at employment based upon technical qualifications is people get hired, and if they do their job well, then they get promoted. The idea of the Peter principle, based upon the work of Lawrence J. Peter, is people will rise to their level of personal incompetence within a bureaucratic structure. Have you ever worked for a manager and thought, how in the world did you get this job supervising people? Because you just don't seem to know what you're doing. Well, what happened was they did the job that you're doing very, very well, and somebody thought, wow, they'll be a good manager. Let's go ahead and hire them as a manager, right? So, reviewing what I've just kind of talked about here, the idea of the division of labor, specialized experts perform specific tasks. Fragmentation of work can remove connection that the workers have to the overall objective of the bureaucracy. This can become problematic. There is a purpose that drives formal organizations. But if you don't have the idea of what the goal of the entire organization is, because all I do is insert tab A into slot B all day long, that can become problematic. When Marx looked at alienation, he looked at alienation as a function of work, specifically what he called lack of meaningful work in a factory setting that's brought about by the division of labor. Alienation, of course, is a condition of estrangement or dissociation from the surrounding society. And for Marx, it was demeaning work or meaningless work within the factory context that caused it. Now, fragmentation of work can lead to something else, trained incapacity. Workers become so specialized they fail to notice obvious problems because they're so focused in on, they develop, literally tunnel vision, just focused on this one thing, and so they develop blind spots and fail to notice obvious problems. Hierarchy of authority. Each position under supervision of higher authority. Written rules and regulations. It's all written down. Rules and regulations ensure uniform performance of every task. So, faculty job description includes the responsibilities of every faculty member. If you're full-time faculty, we all have the same responsibilities when it comes to instruction, maintenance of grades, maintenance of a safe classroom environment, all that kind of stuff. The written rules and regulations provide continuity. Regardless of who's doing the position should be fulfilled, the requirements of the position should be fulfilled in very much the same fashion. Now, goal displacement, overzealous conformity to official regulations, has another name. You might have heard red tape. Think about going to the BMV. Now, they've done away with a lot of that, but it used to be that you would see somebody back there not doing a thing, and somebody else who was handling all kinds of people. And I can remember this happening, like when they first started doing appointments at the DMV in Arizona when I was younger. You would make an appointment and you would go to the DMV. If 40 people happened to have made appointments all at the same time, there was one person handling the appointments line, one person handling the walk-ins. If there were no walk-ins, you couldn't just go over there, because as soon as they brought up your name, oh, well, you made an appointment, you're going to have to go back into the other line. So it's overzealous conformity to official regulations that actually destroys the inefficiency, or destroys the efficiency that the bureaucracy is there to implement in the first place. Impersonality. Bureaucratic norms dictate that officials perform duties without personal consideration to people as individuals. This is what Weber feels leads to alienation in society. People are not treated as individuals. It is more efficient to just give your C number. You're the only one that has that particular combination of digits, right? However, it sure makes you feel like just a cog in a machine, doesn't it? Not like a valued individual. Employment based on technical qualifications. This is simply the idea that you have to demonstrate competency and, to a certain extent, provide certification that you've been trained in competency. And then the Peter Principle, of course, is the idea that every employee within a hierarchy tends to rise to his or her level of incompetence. There is one more characteristic of a bureaucracy that Weber actually included. We've gone through 5 here. The 6th would be formal written communication. Did you get the memo on that? It's not official until you get the interoffice memo on that. That will be another characteristic of bureaucracy that Weber actually included in his original writings on it. But we deal with bureaucracies everywhere. You cannot operate in a modern society without dealing with bureaucratic structures. They are in every organization to some degree or another. So, characteristics of a bureaucracy. If we look at these 5 characteristics, we'll see that they have positive consequences and negative consequences. The division of labor produces efficiency in a large-scale operation, but it produces trains incapacity and produces a narrow kind of tunnel vision view. Hierarchy of authority clarifies who's in command, but it deprives employees of a voice in decision-making, and it permits concealment of mistakes. Written rules of regulations let workers know what's expected of them, but it stifles initiative and imagination and leads to goal displacement, or what Weber would call the irrationality of rationalization. Red tape. Impersonality reduces bias, but it contributes to feelings of alienation and discourages loyalty to any one company. Employment based on technical qualifications discourages favoritism and nepotism, reduces petty rivalries. However, it also discourages ambition to improve one's self elsewhere and fosters the Peter principle. No matter what, I can read as much as I want about psychology. I will not be qualified to teach it until I actually go out and get a degree in it. So, bureaucratization is a term used to refer to the implementation of bureaucracy, the surrendering to bureaucracy as a process. It's a process by which group, organization, or social movement becomes increasingly bureaucratic. Can take place within small group settings. However, you find it more in large group settings. Now, may have heard this term before, oligarchy. It's similar to the term monarchy. Monarchy, if you think mono, one, monarchy, rule by one. Oligarchy is rule by a few individuals who have power. Now, Robert Michels kind of studied unions, socialist parties, labor unions around World War I, before World War I, and came up with this idea of what's called the iron law of oligarchy. Even democratic organizations eventually develop into bureaucracies ruled by a few. Every bureaucratic structure comes to be ruled by a few key people who kind of know how to get things done. They either have skills, leadership, knowledge, or charismatic authority, kind of charisma. And this is what leads to the iron law of oligarchy. Even democratic organizations, if you think about it like in Congress, in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, are all senators, are all representatives equal, or do some seem to accumulate much more power than others? Okay, now, when we look at bureaucracy and organizational culture, classic theory, also known as the scientific management approach, this came out of the work of Frederick Taylor in the early part of the 20th century. The idea behind this is that workers are motivated mostly by economic rewards. And if you understand the principles of management, you can supervise any workers. Because you understand what motivates them, you understand how to motivate them, because you understand the principles of management. So what we do is we apply scientific planning to establish performance standards, and then we get the workers working at optimum efficiency, which increases the amount of economic reward they get. Now, another way of taking a look at bureaucracy and organizational culture, and something that's become more popular in the latter half of the 20th century, is what's called the human relations approach, which looks at the role of people, communication, and participation within a bureaucracy. And these roles are what get emphasized. If you've ever heard of empowering employees, that's part of the human relations approach. Okay? So this came out of kind of interactionist approach when we look at because it's a micro-level approach. We look at people and we want them to be able to do well in the job they're doing, so we empower them to be able to perform at that job. Okay, on page 127 of your textbook, you have a look at McDonald's and the worldwide bureaucratization of society. George Ritzer was a sociologist who wrote a book called The McDonaldization of Society. And what he does is he looks at how the management principles and the bureaucratic principles and the operational principles of McDonald's have become applied increasingly across bureaucratic structures in the United States of America. We know that all fast food restaurants operate in essentially the same fashion, right? Stripped down menu in order to increase efficiency, lower price, and reduce time for service, time for person to receive the good. So, Burger King, Wendy's, Starbucks, all these other places have applied the division of labor, have applied Weber's bureaucratic principles into, in a very stripped down form, into the production of food. The thing is this is not the only place we see it. Think about urgent care. Isn't that kind of a stripped down version of the emergency room? Fewer options there, reduced cost. You can go to urgent care for a lot of things, but not everything. You can go to McDonald's for a lot of things, but not everything. We have drive-through weddings. We have drive-through divorces in Las Vegas now. So when you think about the features of these restaurants, speed, yes. We start to get upset if we have to wait more than 5 minutes for a meal at McDonald's, right? That's just too long to wait for McDonald's food. But isn't the quality kind of reduced there? I mean, think about it. How good is a McDonald's hamburger, actually, compared to the best burger you've ever had, or even just a really good burger cooked out back on your grill in the backyard? It's not quite as good. What do you see here at college as far as using the model of bureaucracy? What elements of McDonaldization do you see here? Impersonality? Well, most definitely, right? Hierarchy of authority? Yep, there's a chain of command. So, when we look at the elements of bureaucracy that Max Weber talked about, and we see them applied in fast food to really kind of increase efficiency, it's not the only place it's happening. It's happening all over society. The increased use, like even in this online context, the increased use of Blackboard, it reduces the necessity to have classroom locations because we have virtual classrooms now. So, what's going on with the changing workplace now? Organizational restructuring. Organizations have been experimenting with new ways of getting the job done since the late 20th century. They have gone sometimes to what is called collective decision-making, which really kind of represents maybe less of a vertical hierarchy of authority and more of a horizontal hierarchy of authority. So they're minimizing the hierarchy. Instead of having, a very tall vertical hierarchical structure of authority, you might have 4 people on teams, each led by a team leader, all of whom may report to a CEO or something like that. So project teams and task forces. And so, these are some of the ways we've seen this increase. A lot more kind of independent contractors, increased reliance on outside providers, less, less kind of long-term 20-year career orientation, much more I'm just doing this for, this one contract, and I'm a private contractor, and you pay me and I do it, and then I move on. Also, facilitated communication between those at the very top and the very bottom of the hierarchies. We actually see this here at Ivy Tech, believe it or not. You have direct line to President Tom Snyder in Campus Connect. What's your idea? That goes straight to his office. If you submit an idea on how to do something better, so students and faculty and administration all have access. So we have facilitated communication. We can actually write an idea down, and it will get all the way to the president of the college. Telecommuting. This actually right here, what we're doing is a form of telecommuting. Employees who work full or part-time at home rather than in an outside office. Now, I happen to be doing this sitting in my office, but I could just as easily be doing this at home. A lot of times when I'm doing work in the online class I teach, I'm at home. I grade stuff at home. I don't have to come into my office to work. I can work from my home. In fact, there are instructors out there who teach only online. Never really have to come in. 8.5 million in 1995, up to 40 million now. Electronic communication as well. Email is efficient, rapidly communicated, and democratic. So all of these things are kind of changing the workplace that we see, right? Now, part of the problem with email, and it can be monitored, which companies like. It doesn't necessarily leave a permanent record. Once you delete an email, it's not like a letter that you can put in a box somewhere and save. Doesn't convey body language. Now, that can be good and bad. Why do you think we have emoticons? Because electronic communication can be misinterpreted. Could contribute significantly to fragmentation of work. Electronic communication, an email gets sent kind of down a chain, and people get assigned specific tasks out of an overall project. So when we look at telecommuting here, there are pros and cons for it. You can find this little table on page 129 of your textbook. Pros: flexible schedule, freedom to work anywhere, reduced expense and stress from commuting, environmental benefits of reduced commuting, facilitates caregiving for children and aged parents, reduces terrorist targets. Cons: disconnectedness from fellow employees. At home still meets at work. There's no separation between work and home anymore. When it comes to getting promoted, out of sight may mean out of mind. You got to have high-speed internet. Management loses some control. Downgrade security of electronic information. And sometimes, you've seen these, right? Scams that masquerade as telecommuting opportunities. Earn $5,000 a week out of home. Earn $85,000 a year working out of home. A lot of times these are scams. They're not real opportunities. Okay, kind of wrapping up here. When we look at unions, which are a component of, or which are formal organizations that are worker advocacy organizations. This is just kind of social policy and organization sections of the textbook. When we look at the state of the unions worldwide, there's a little chart in there. In the United States of America, 1970, we had 23.5% of laborers in union membership. Now we're down to like less than 12%. Sweden is very high. Austria was high but has seen a reduction. Canada has held steady. Australia was at a high of 50% and is now down to less than 20%. We have seen unions fall off everywhere. So what's happened to diminish the importance of organized labor unions? dropped from 39% in 1954 to 11.9% in 2010. Those are averages kind of worldwide. Have unions perhaps outlived their usefulness in a rapidly changing global economy dominated by the service industry? That may be one thing, you know. When we look at the issue, organized workers who share either the same skill or same employer. This has kind of changed. So, you know, when we think about it, the power of labor unions vary from country to country. Membership is declining, changes in industry, growth in part-time jobs, the legal system, globalization, employer offensives, union rigidity, and bureaucratization. Changes in industry. A lot of industry, a lot of jobs, manufacturing jobs, which were kind of the backbone of the unions here in the U.S., have been outsourced. And when we look at like the auto industry specifically, the unions are still very strong in Detroit, but there's another kind of auto manufacturing center in the South, from Georgia, North Carolina, all, you know, along those states, and the union presence there is very, very weak. Growth in part-time jobs. As people retire, their positions have not been filled by another full-time worker. Companies have made the decision to hire part-time workers instead of full-time workers. When we talk about the legal system, unions have been somewhat under attack. The United States has not made it particularly easy for unions to organize in bargains. Think about when Reagan fired the air traffic controllers. Right now in New Jersey, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Illinois, teachers unions are under attack. A lot of government policies, like in what you hear called right to work states. When you hear right to work legislation, a lot of time that legislation is aimed at diminishing the power of unions. Globalization, outsourcing of jobs, hostile employers. You know, you make the mistake of saying the word union at some companies. Like if you say the word union in Walmart, they'll terminate you. You know, Walmart is very hostile towards the idea of unionization. And then union rigidity. In the past, labor unions have been slow to embrace minority status workers. And then because of bureaucratization, it seems like unions spend more time electing president of the union, you know, leader of the union, than they do actually advocating for the employees, for the members of the union. Okay, so when we look at this issue through the lens of sociology, Marxists and functionalists both view unions as logical response to emergence of impersonal, large-scale, formal, and often alienating organizations. One of the differences, of course, conflict theorists, which would be where Marxists are, note the longer union leaders are in office, the less responsive they are to the needs and demands of the rank and file. Many union employees have role conflict. They may have conflict from two different statuses they hold. One as a union employee and another as maybe a minority member. Or if they're a foreman. So, when we talk about union rights, the U.S., as far as high-income, industrialized nations, is unique in allowing employers to actively oppose employees' right to organize. That's why you find unions, in general, stronger in other countries, except for maybe South Korea and France, as far as when we talk about industrialized, high-income nations. Another thing that happens is state and local governments across the U.S. facing significant budget deficits. This is why governors are, you know, advocating for right-to-work legislation. unions have lost a lot of the power they had in the political process here in the U.S. In Europe, they still tend to play a major role in political elections. So what we find is that the form and substance of unions varies from nation to nation. In China, the government actually ordered the workers to unionize, Walmart's 31,000 workers to unionize, regardless of what the corporation wanted. But the Chinese unions are controlled by the Communist Party, which is the only political party there. So that's a little different than what you might find here in the U.S. Here's a chart. This is the chart I was looking at when I was talking about rates of union membership among workers, kind of on if we look at a few selected high-income industrialized nations. You can see the U.S. is close to the bottom there. We're not at the absolute bottom, but, you know, we are substantially lower than Canada, Australia, Netherlands, and Japan when it comes to union membership. Okay, that kind of concludes our look at Sociology, Chapter 6, Groups and Formal Organizations. At this point in time, had there been anybody in attendance, we would have done kind of a question and answer session. I would have taken some time to address any issues that students may have. And in the future, that will be what we'll be doing. We will actually, you are able to type messages into the chat box, and you can do that during the lecture as well. I will stop the lecture and answer any questions that pop up in my chat box at all. But there will be specific time set aside here at the end of the PowerPoint lecture for questions and answers. Anything students feel I might have skipped over too quickly, anything you feel like you would like me to elucidate slightly more, just feel free to let me know. Okay, I hope to see some students in attendance at my next session. Everybody, if you're listening to this, I hope this has been beneficial to you. And I hope that this has helped you with understanding some of the concepts in this particular chapter.